for this video, I'm going to be talking about how I feel about Jimmy Olsen being Guardian. That is, Jimmy Olsen on CW's Supergirl as played by McCade Brooks. But before I get into that, I'm going to be talking about the history of the character in comics. And, well, comics and more than comics. I'm going to try to put chapter times in the description below. So if you just want to, get to the end portion of when I'm talking about my opinion of that, you're welcome to do so. But first, I'm going to be talking about the history of the character. So let's get started. Now, Jimmy Olsen did not start off in comics. He actually started on the Superman radio show. And this radio show was being put out during the 40s. Now, Perry White is also a character who first appeared on the radio show and had not previously been in comics. And now, pretty much, in the mid-30s, we get Action Comics issue number 1, and we get Clark Kent, Superman, and Lois Lane. And these are the most iconic characters that carry on even to this day. But, we did not have either Jimmy or Perry. These characters started off in the radio show, then become integrated into comics. Long before Harley Quinn went from animation to comics, we had Perry and Jimmy, going from radio to comics, and they become very much part of this Superman mythos and, the Superman family that we all know to this day. We all know, Clark, the Chief, Jimmy, and Lois. These are things that have seemed to have existed all the time, even though originally, when Superman started, that is not what we had at first. And I find that very interesting. Again, the first radio appearance of Jimmy Olsen was in April 15th, 1940, and the character was created so Superman had someone to talk to. Someone other than, Perry White or Lois Lane, someone else to interact with and describe things to, and so on, and, take part of his adventures. Now, Jackie Kelk was the first voice of Jimmy from 1940 to 1947. Jack Grimms later took over. And, again, this character, appeared quite often in the radio show and only later would appear in comics. And that would be in Superman issue 13, which came out in November 1941. So after a year of him being on the radio show, he appears in comic book form. Perry White had actually appeared, several issues earlier. But this is the first appearance of Jimmy Olsen, here as a young blonde-haired kid, and he's a cub reporter, or at least he wants to be a reporter. But the chief isn't having it. Clark and Lois are investigating a archer who's killing wealthy men and whatnot. And Jimmy wants to get in on this action and report the story. He even would stow away on the back seat of the car, but he of course gets himself into trouble, and here he is running away with Lois Lane. And this is his first appearance in comics. Young cub reporter trying to prove himself, and he would make a few sporadic appearances in the 40s, and early 50s. So in comics, he was not as popular as he would later become. Again, he appeared quite frequently in the radio show, and only later became integrated in the comics. Now, the first live-action Jimmy Olsen appeared in the movie serials, which would be, first Superman, and then Animan versus Superman. And this is starting Kirk Alyn as Superman. And, the first Jimmy Olsen live action would be Tommy Bond, the actor to portray him. And, Tommy Bond appeared in both of these serials as Jimmy Olsen. Along with the Chief, Lois Lane, again, as if he was always there, part of the Superman family and the part of the Superman mythos. But even with this, live action appearance in the radio show, he still had sporadic appearances in the 40s and early 50s. Now, a bit later on, we get probably the most significant appearance of Jimmy Olsen, and that's in The Adventures of Superman, starring the late great George Reeves. And the first actor to play to play Jimmy Olsen in this TV series would be the late Jack Larson. And he is probably the most iconic actor to play Jimmy Olsen. And this is probably one of the most iconic appearances of Jimmy Olsen. And it's because of Jack Larson's appearance as Jimmy Olsen that he would become so popular, not just on this TV series, but in comics. And this in this series, again, he's the cover reporter, but he's also the comic foil, getting in fun adventures and so on. Probably one of my favorite episodes is Jimmy Olsen Private Eye, because it's such a funny episode, and Jack Larson has such great comic timing. There will be other fun episodes with him, but that's one of my favorites. Now, because of the popularity of the character on Adventures of Superman, Jimmy Olsen would get his own title. And this is probably one of the earliest, spin-off comics. And that would be Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, which first came out in September 1954. The TV series was from 52 to 58, and this comic book came out in 1954. In fact, the very first page of the comic referenced the fact that he was you saw him first on TV, as Superman's pal. Now read about his adventures. And, these comics, that's ran throughout the 50s and 60s would be, typical of that, comics of that era. Very fun-filled adventures and, very silly, stories and whatnot. And there would be, some issues that would dovetail various episodes, such as Jimmy Olsen, King for a Day, that was seen in the comic and it's seen as one of the episodes. And there will be other comics and episodes that would, match up with each other. And that's largely due to the fact of the editorial team on DC Comics, making sure everything is dovetailing each other. But the point is, Jack Larson made such a great appearance as, Jimmy Olsen, that he became a much more popular character. And, the comic, was spawned out of that popularity. And, again, it's going off fun-filled stories and comical stories. Just fun adventures and silly adventures and whatnot, stuff like that. And that's the early image of Jimmy Olsen as the slight comic relief for many years. Now after the 50s and throughout much of the 60s, Jimmy Olsen's popularity would dwindle. Whereas for many years he is probably the second most iconic orange-haired kid in comics. The first, of course, being Archie, who was the most well-known orange-haired kid in comics. Jimmy Olsen would take second place of one of the most iconic orange-haired characters in comics, and comical characters as well. But as 50s and 60s moved on, his popularity in comics would dwindle. And, it's only much later in the 70s that he makes a bit of a revival because, his comic was not selling well. So we get in, issue 133, Jack Kirby doing Jimmy Olsen. And this is when we get the foundation of what would become the Fourth World, where Jack Kirby is slowly introducing us to the Fourth World and its mythos. And it all starts out with Jimmy Olsen. And in fact, here we get the first appearance of what would become Project Cadmus. Kirby calls it the DNA scientist, but it later becomes Cadmus. Now, Cadmus, as we know, is what creates the Con-El Superboy, excuse me. But we get here Project Cadmus and the basic elements, including Double X, who would be sort of the human alien, one of the most recognizable elements of Cadmus. All of it created by Kirby. And, so Kirby, revives the character, but by doing so, he's ushering in his own mythos with the Fourth World. But, again, after the 50s and 60s, the character kind of dwindled in popularity. He would appear in the first Christopher Reeve Superman movies and make appearances throughout, the rest of the Christopher Reeve series, and make an appearance in the Supergirl movie as well. But you notice here that he's more of a background character. He's not as much in the forefront as he used to be. So again, it's dwindling in popularity. But he's still one of the most recognizable elements of the Superman mythos. In fact, for the late 80s Superboy TV series, we get a Jimmy Olsen-like character in the form of TJ White. It's not, a young Jimmy Olsen. It's a Jimmy Olsen-like character. Whereas here, it's TJ White, the son of Perry White, who's, has all the basics of what Jimmy Olsen is. A young photographer who wants to be a reporter. Although in this series, TJ is more interested in being a stand-up comic, but that's a whole different story, as but anyways, we get a Jimmy Olsen-like image here, and it's later in the Lois and Clark series that we get two actors playing Jimmy Olsen. First, it would be Michael Landers, and later it's Justin Whalen. And again, he's more of the, not so much comical character, but it's a lighthearted show as is, but he's still a key element to this series. And throughout, the history of Superman, he's appeared in various animation in the 60s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. But, again, as a background character, he did appear on Smallville, played by Aaron Ashmore, but that's a more complex, storyline, so it's hard to describe. And I'm not really going to go into all the details of that. I don't have time for the complexities of Smallville. Anyways, point is that Jimmy Olsen started off in radio as, a friend and confidant of Superman. He makes a few sporadic appearances in the 40s, but then in the mid-50s, we get his most iconic image, that still stands with us, as the, young comical character, cub reporter, and Jack Larson, the most recognizable actor for the role. He would make Jimmy Olsen would make sporadic appearances on other stories, but usually as a background character. He does, take part in events in other series, but he's still kind of in the background. And for the first season of Supergirl, which again appeared on another network, he's played by McCade Brooks, and here it's a race-bending role, and which is fine, no big deal. And here he's trying to go off on his own as a reporter for this first season, and confident of Supergirl working along with Windshot as her behind-the-scenes man. Both of them are actually. Excuse me. And for this first season, he's a love interest, which thankfully the second season kind of dropped and only barely referenced. And that's kind of a good thing, we don't need more love triangles on the CW. Anyways, so let's talk more about his appearance as Guardian. Now, we know the Golden Guardian was a completely different person in comics. He was created by Kirby in, I believe it was the 40s and so on, as a character who ran with the Newsboy Legion. But very Captain American-ish. Here we see him in the 70s as a clone created by Cadmus, or DNA scientist, if you will. And this is probably the most recognizable version of Guardian. And in fact, it's this version that we see in the animated series Young Justice. Now, yes, this is the typical version of Guardian. But Jimmy Olsen is a different version. And, if you can just get over the fact that, yes, this is not the comics. And other than the name Guardian, there's really no similarity. In some ways, almost, it's a little bit more like the 80s character, Gangbuster, who appeared in comics. And he was a brief vigilante who was in the Superman mythos and, part of the Superman stories of the 80s. The Guardian Jimmy Olsen is a little bit more like that. But the point is, this series is making its own thing. Other than the name Guardian, that's the only link to the comic book character. That's it. But let's recognize what's being accomplished here. And that is, this is the first time that something really significant and something really different has been done with the character. For so many years, he's been either a background character or a comical character or just simply Superman's pal. He's been the sidekick for so many years. Now we have him in this series as his own hero. Making himself his own man as a hero. And, I really like that Wynn is working with him behind the scenes as his, if you will, Oracle, and, working with him. And again, that's something else that's interesting about Wynn's character is as his helper and confidant. Because now this is something interesting that Wynn's character is doing, because, it's a little bit, frankly, it's a little bit more interesting than him working in the DEO and working on Catco. Because, it gives his character something to do. Because when, just typing a computer in Cadmus, that's not really doing anything. He's not really being proactive. He would sometimes help Supergirl and be proactive that way. But here he gets to be much more part of the action and be proactive that way. In the essence that he's helping Jimmy plan his moves and, block this move, or you need to go this way and do such and such to achieve such and such. So he's taking more of a proactive part of, in terms of character and characterization. And Jimmy Olsen himself is doing the same thing. And again, Jimmy Olsen has a, especially during the 50s, gone through many transformations. A lot of them silly, such as the giant turtle boy and, things like that. But, he has had briefly superhero elements in it, and that would be as Elastic Lad. And he would be Elastic Lad as join the Legion of Superheroes, but very briefly. He's not a regular member. He's only more of an on-off member, and and I guess you could say this is a first in comics of a Jimmy as a superhero. But let's be honest, there are so many stretching characters in comic. Plastic Man, Mr. Fantastic, and DC, had one. In fact, his name escapes me. Elastic Man or whatever. And Jimmy as Elastic Lad, it's just another knockoff of another stretching character. And let's also appreciate a stretching character that's kind of difficult for a TV budget, But we really don't need another stretching character, elastic character. For Jimmy as Guardian, we have him as a proactive superhero and vigilante, making himself his own man. And so for me, I think it's wonderful. I think it's great because it's something new. It's something different. It's something we've never ever seen before in comics or TV. So I encourage CW to continue with this and to keep doing this. And I say to you viewers, give it a chance. Suspend your disapproval that it's not the exact comic book character or that it's not exactly what was presented in comics. Suspend that for a few minutes, because let's face it, no TV series, movie, or whatever is 100% like the comics. In fact, the entirety of the show isn't 100% like the comics. You read Supergirl comics throughout the years, and it's a little bit different than what we're seeing here. So accept this is a different version. This is its own thing. And it's something different. Something we've never seen before. So I say give it a chance. Let's run with this. Let's advance with this. Let's, revel in this. That we have a character that's doing something different and proactive. So that's my glowing review of what's going on with Jimmy. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you.